Now about Oreshnik. Why, in your view, can't Putin simply be abducted in the same way like Maduro?
I think the worst nightmare for Putin, like any other dictator, is to end up like Gaddafi or Mussolini. They worry about that a lot. And we know that because there's been a lot of different leaders and dictators over the years.
Now about Oreshnik. Analysts say that without a nuclear warhead, this missile is merely an expensive, low-accuracy projectile that is far less effective than conventional Iskanders. Do you agree that the use of Oreshnik is not a show of strength, but rather a technological scream of desperation? And does it indicate that Putin is running out of real tools of intimidation, forcing him to use strategic weapons as an expensive firework for domestic audiences to sustain the myth of a global war you've described?
Yeah, I think that Russia historically and currently we see they're not very effective at actual military related things like attacking or creating new weapons, but they are very effective in trying to message it and trying to create the right narrative around it. And so Oreshnik, they talked about for a long time. It's been a couple of years now. I've heard about Oreshnik. They've actually used it, a couple of times now in total. It's not very impressive. Militarily, it's certainly not something that is shocking or amazing or no one's really dazzled by, but it's this threat they bring out all the time. So it's really the message that they're sending more than the weapon itself. The weapon, as you pointed out, if it's not using a nuclear warhead, it's not really effective. It's extremely expensive. They can't produce many of them, it seems. But if they are going to continue doing this near the NATO border, as they just did, not so far from Poland, because it was near Lviv where they last attacked, that is something that could, of course, work in their favor, they calculate. They believe that the Western countries then would say, any day they could actually put nuclear warheads on this and attack a European capital. But it's exactly that fear that Russia has been trying to milk for the entire length of this war. We're going on 4 years now, and it's always the saber rattling. It's always the way that Russia operates, which for a lot of reasons I think is wholly unrealistic that they would use nuclear weapons. But either way, it's at this point, I think Russia's only solution is to try to change the narrative, try to change what's going on, where people are not talking about the fact that their allies globally are collapsing, that the Russian economy is in a abysmal state. But what can you distract the population by? Well, Oreshnik. So they talk about Oreshnik more. But at the end of the day, it's not a game changer for Russia.
And in a recent video, you gave a brilliant historical overview of how Russia has consumed its allies in Iran over centuries, drawing parallels with 1907 and 1941, when Russia treated Iran purely as a tool and betrayed it at the first opportunity. Today, we see protests in Iran and a collapsing real. If the Ayatollah regime begins to falter, how would that affect Russia's logistics? Could this trigger a domino effect, where Russians elites, seeing a key ally fall, start hedging their risks and looking for exits, realizing that Moscow may be next?
So for Russia, these allies, such as Iran, are important for several reasons. And one of those reasons is simply because as a country that is sanctioned, they're part of a black market. They work with each other, Iran, Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea. They work together because they do not have access to normal means of banking, normal means of doing finance. So they can't just go out and buy weapons as a normal country would, or even deal with financial institutions as a normal country would. So they have to work with each other. But who else is involved in the black markets are things like illegal organizations, hence Hezbollah's role. We look in the case of Latin America, the drug cartels. We look at the illegal organizations like FARC in Colombia. But all these different organizations, all these different movements globally, what they really have in common is not ideology. Quite obviously, North Korea has very little in common ideologically with Russia or with Iran. But what they do have in common is the fact that they all need access to different goods that due to sanctions they cannot get, and that's why they work together. But going ahead, what that means for Russia is strategically a couple different things. One, their world is shrinking. With whom they can do business is much less than what it was before. But this is very important for when you're dealing with the shadow fleets, because that is specifically existent to get around sanctions. Now, the Iranians are truly experts at getting around sanctions. Now, they've been sanctioned by the United States since 1980 or 1979, so they've got lots of experience. They're very good at it, and they've helped the Russians a lot with that. But there's something else that's very important, is that when they are working together, things like the shadow fleets globally, The major countries that use shadow fleets are Russia and Iran and Venezuela. But when they no longer are able to do that, and that's being broken, it's something that affects all of them. They're all feeling the repercussions of that. For Russia going ahead, though, losing its ally will definitely create a strong amount of concern within the Kremlin and within those in the elites, because they realize without that ally, who else does Russia have to work with? At home in Russia, they produce very little. There's very little. I mean, just think about it yourself. Is in your own house, what have you ever bought that's from Russia? We don't buy refrigerators. We don't buy cars. We don't buy clothes. There's really very little that Russia produces. So when it's a losing partner, since unable to deal with business, it's going to be harder and harder for Russia to continue operating as a normal country. So I think, yes, actually Iran specifically, because they are the experts at sanction violations or how to evade sanctions, that will be something that could very well upset the cart for Putin.
You noted that from January 1st, conscription in Russia has become a year-round process, turning the war into a permanent administrative burden. How does this shift from the special military operation somewhere on TV to constant expectation of a draft notice, break the unwritten social contract between Putin and the deep people, and could this routinization of fear combined with new taxes like the 22% VAT become the trigger that brings the war onto the streets of Moscow as you forecast for 2026?
So going ahead in 2026, I think we're going to see a few different things. One, for Russia, there is a significantly good chance of a destabilizing event, and that could take several different forms. It could be in the form of hyperinflation, which is the most likely predictor of any sort of social unrest, is economics. Well, we see that today in Iran as an example. Even the French Revolution, it was increase the cost of bread is why people come to the streets. It's not because of ideology. But either way, if we look at what's going on in the economic factors, historically, Russia has had this happen before. World War I, their lines collapsed, their military sort of just imploded, and that was because there was a lot going on economically in the country, and people just lost faith that the government was going to be able to withstand all that was happening. So for Russia today, they're in a very similar situation. There's a lot of different similarities between them that I think might repeat, and in the near term, that might very well include things such as seeing people in the elites try to flee the country or to try to take out their assets or try to sell off their assets. Now, the reason that the National Wealth Fund is selling off gold deposits, which is very strange because they definitely need the gold, but why are they selling it all off? I have a hypothesis that one part of it, of course, is because they want liquidity, but another part of it is because the elites actually want to buy gold. They realize that the Russian ruble itself has very little value. It's not a real value. I mean, the central bank just comes up with a number. It's like the Soviet ruble. It wasn't, it was pegged. It was not just a fiat currency. So in this case today, it's pretty much the same thing. And that's why I think that if something starts to go south really fast, where people can no longer make ends meet in mass, the reason that would pose a problem for the Kremlin is not because I expect a red revolution where people are in the streets, overthrowing the government. That's extremely improbable in Russia. Much more probable is that something the elites realizes it's their chance now to take power, that the government's unusually weak and it's not able to protect itself. And seeing that it's not able to protect itself is exactly when you should strike.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reacted to Maduro's abdication by saying that America knows what to do with another dictator, clearly hunting at Putin. Why, in your view, can't Putin simply be abducted in the same way like Maduro?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. One is that simply the United States recognizes Putin to be the president of Russia. They do not recognize Maduro. Maduro's wanted going back a number of years during the Biden administration and earlier. There have been a number of different, not only sanctions, but warrants for his arrest. When you have a warrant for this arrest, it means that the government of the United States is seeking to put him behind bars, to bring him to justice. And so that was not recent. That was going back, as I said, a number of years, where if you were to turn him over, you would get $25 million, and they've increased it since then. Now, in the case of Putin, one, he's not wanted by the U.S. Two, he's recognized as the president of the country, and they have sovereign immunity. Because he's the president of a country that you usually are considered to have immunity. In the case, again, of Maduro, it's a little bit different because the U.S. does not recognize him as the leader of the country. But I think there's another thing is that, very rarely I think there's a potential for escalation with Russia. In the case of trying to actually arrest Putin, one would be much more difficult. I mean, the Russians are much better organized than are the Venezuelans. And there's a lot of different things going on in the Venezuelan side that made this possible, including collusion from different people. But in the case of Russia, I think that it would be physically just much harder, given how Putin organizes his life. and how much more secretive it is. But then let's imagine that you did try to arrest him. That could very well launch a real full war, and I don't think anybody's willing to take that risk.
In your opinion, should what happened to Venezuela's been seen as warning signal for Putin personally?
Well, I think that, I mean, looking at what the U.S. president said right before and right after, I think it's definitely meant to be taken as a warning to other people. Right before, you might recall, a day or two before, the U.S. president wrote that the Iranians should be careful not to shoot any of the protesters, or else they would have to pay for it, or he would make them pay for it, I think is the way he phrased it. Now, why it's sort of interesting is, at the time, I was sort of surprised he said that. I was really surprised that the U.S. president was so concerned with human rights. But then, in the context, a couple days later, when they arrested Maduro, it all made much more sense, is that he's trying to take as much leverage out of this as he can. Because now everybody realizes, yes, it's possible. Yes, it's possible he will do something radical. And so in the case of, look at Colombia as just a small example, the president there, in a New York Times interview just a couple days ago, said that he was absolutely certain that any day they could show up and arrest him as well. And he'd call people to rally in the streets because of it. We've seen the case of Iran. The leadership of the country now is saying that everything that's happening is really being provoked by Donald Trump. It's not actually, being led by the people of Iran. Now, that's simply not the case. But either way, we see that it did have an effect across the entire ecosystem of leaders and autocrats, where they do worry what their safety and security will look like in the future.
In your opinion, now for Putin, what the worst nightmare for Putin?
I think the worst nightmare for Putin, like any other dictator, is to end up like Gaddafi or Mussolini. They worry about that a lot. And we know that because there's been a lot of different leaders and dictators over the years who have relayed what they fear. And sometimes when we look at history, it's sort of interesting how it has a lot of similarities over time. Now, going ahead, what we can expect, I think, for Putin is that the worst case scenario would be that his regime falls. And that's why, up until the last minute, he will do absolutely everything necessary to keep the elites allegiant to him. Even if the people of Russia tomorrow starve, as long as he can keep the military and the intelligence service on his side, he'll be okay. Now, he's very strong with the intelligence service, and I think the military is generally pretty cowardly. Russia does not have a history of military coups like other countries that have them quite regularly. Russia doesn't, which is actually the highest predictor historically if a country will have a military coup is if they've had them before, if there's a pattern of it. But either way, it doesn't have a pattern of it. But I think for Putin to see his regime overthrown and to face justice at the hands of a crowd or at the hands of The Hague would be something that he would absolutely be terrified by.
You've said that the strategic goal of Ukraine strikes more than 1,000 drones in a single week is to stretch Russian air defenses and create gaps. We know now see Moscow airports shutting down. Are we approaching the moment when Putin faces a Sophia's choice? Defend the front or defend Rublyovka and the Kremlin? And how do you think Moscow elite will react when they realize that Panzer systems have been moved to protect an oil refinery in Tuapse, leaving their own homes exposed to Ukrainian drones?
So overall, I think that we already see that happening. We saw in the case of Valdai, where Putin has his palace. There is, I escaped the number now, I want to say there's 16 different air defense systems around it, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, that's a lot of air defense systems. And it's a lot more, they don't have these sorts of things on the battlefield. They obviously don't have them for the oil refineries as they need them, or the quantity that they need for them. But of course, Putin's going to prioritize himself above all other things, well above his soldiers for sure. But either way, going ahead, I think that there's a very good sign that Russia is simply running out of air defense. Ukraine is playing full court. It's taking shots across the country. It's hitting regions, even somewhere like Kamchatka, which is 7,000 kilometers, which is 5,000 miles away from the front line. They've had the internet turned out now for several weeks, and it's because the government there is worried. Near the border of Japan, they're worried that the Ukrainians could use drones there against them. So it shows you how totally fearful the Russian population has become, and especially the leadership. Going ahead, I think the best thing that can happen at this point is that there's more and more drone strikes. And the more that there are within the country, it doesn't even have to destroy, oil refineries are great, I'm all in favor, but I think that there's another aspect of this, which is psychological warfare. Let's imagine if you were to attack the buildings in downtown Moscow, say Moscow City, which is a specific development or neighborhood, upper class and wealthy. But there's a lot of offices there for things like insurance companies. There's a lot of offices there for things like the shipping industry. Now, let's imagine that there were to be some drone strikes there, or near the Moscow Stock Exchange, but several days in a row. I think that it doesn't really matter what they attack. It doesn't actually have to blow up anything. It doesn't have to hurt anybody. But just imagine that there's Ukrainian drones flying over these places. Now, if you're an actuary in the insurance company, would you say, if you have to make a calculation, what is the increased risk that drones will strike something? Well, it's very hard to do the math, but when you see the drones with your own eyes a few days in a row, I think that you would become much more conservative in your estimations. I think going ahead as well, if you're at the Moscow Stock Exchange and you see this is what's happening, what would be your interpretation? Of course, that things in the country are not very stable, and I think that would help people to sell off their stocks. But all these different things can be combined, and once again, they can sort of stack on each other to make sure that it has more of a force on the Russian economy to make sure that it is not able to continue financing this war.
Today with us be Jason J. Smart, PhD, Kyiv-based national security strategist, political analyst, and content creator. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your brilliant thoughts and analysis. See you next time.
Thank you, Alexander.